The streets are hard, you know? But I'm even harder. It all just comes so naturally to me, you know? There's a whole world of underground drug culture that most people don't know about. In film, it's often depicted in overdramatic and often violent ways, like in Requiem for a Dream or Spun, for example. Now, this isn't to say that Hollywood does a bad job at depicting drug culture, because real-life drug culture is often boring and, if depicted accurately, wouldn't really make for good cinema. But there are a few films that have attempted to capture drug culture in all of its unproductive and self-absorbed glory, like Larry Clark's 1995 film Kids, the 2014 Safdie brothers film Heaven Knows What, and most recently, an internet miniseries called Golden Hour, written and directed by internet movie critic and indie filmmaker Ralph Sepe, better known as Ralph the Movie Maker here on YouTube. Made with a budget of $7,000, Golden Hour is Ralph's attempt at a drug crime thriller, without all the bells and whistles of a film like Spun, offering us a more realistic peek into the lives of suburban drug dealers. Now, depicting drug culture in a realistic or even semi-realistic way is not really that easy, because drug use, like any other lifestyle choice, is often slow and uninteresting except on very rare occasions. In Larry Clark's film Kids, a lot of the movie is spent just following these two kids around as they try to find ways to get high, get drunk, and escape the reality of their meaningless lives. A lot of the film is just random drug-induced conversations, and the plot just takes a back seat for the most part. Heaven Knows What arguably has even less plot, and once again, 90% of the film is just following this girl around as she tries to find her next quick fix, or accomplish some other menial task that's treated as though it's of great importance to show how much your priorities change when you become an addict, and just how incapable you are of thinking about the distant future. Both of these films, in my opinion, are fantastic, and while films like Requiem for a Dream have their place, it's refreshing to see something that attempts to capture the less dramatic but far more realistic and raw side of drug culture. So with that being said, where does Ralph's Golden Hour fit into all of this? First of all, I think it's important to note that this isn't a feature film, but rather a miniseries, and a fairly short one at that. With only a little over 30 minutes for all 3 episodes, I'm hard-pressed to even call this a miniseries, since it's only about as long as a single episode of an actual TV miniseries. This leaves us with a lot of story being squeezed down into a very little runtime, which results in some pretty mediocre pacing. There's rarely any moments of poignant silence in the series, with the exception of the first few minutes. This gives the audience very little time to really sit and fester in what it is they just saw, unless you count the breaks between each episode. But each episode is so short that I can't realistically see anybody taking a break between each episode, especially since all 3 episodes were uploaded together, and we live in a culture where people love to binge content for hours on end. So this 30-minute miniseries is just going to be a blip in most people's entertainment consumption. Now, this is actually really juxtaposed to Ralph's last project, Lover, which I already did a review on, link in the description, where there was way too much poignant silence, which made every scene feel way more dramatic and important than it actually was, which made the film feel really slow. So I say that this miniseries at least fixed that problem enough to the point where I never felt bored while watching it like I did with Lover. In terms of the plot, the series isn't nearly as aimless as something like Heaven Knows What, which can be both a good and a bad thing. I mean, on one hand, plot is a good thing to have, because 90% of movies tend to have one, but I'm of the opinion that not every film needs one. If your goal is to depict the life of a lazy stoner, then you'd want to write a script that's really rich in character and not in plot devices. In Heaven Knows What, not really much happens to the main character plot-wise, and at the end of the movie, she's pretty much in the exact same position she was at the beginning. But the film is very rich in character. Just seeing the way that she interacts with the world around her gives us a better idea of how she is than any number of plot devices ever could. I feel like Golden Hour has too much plot for its own good. My favorite scenes throughout the series are the ones where it's just Ralph talking with other characters about random shit. It gives off this sort of Clerks-esque vibe that I like quite a lot, but it's intermingled with this plot about drug dealing that just isn't nearly as interesting to me, and on top of that, it really ruins the sort of hazy, drug-induced vibe that the rest of the series has by suddenly thrusting us into this high-stakes thriller. Now, you could argue that this was done intentionally to represent the feeling of crashing after a good high, suddenly being thrust back into reality and realizing the true nature of your situation. But again, this feeling doesn't at all feel earned because of how short the series is and how little time we're given to truly bask in the high. And on top of that, there's a much better way to capture that feeling without suddenly thrusting a plot into our laps in the last 10 minutes. Going back to Heaven Knows What, this entire film plays through this sort of drug-induced haze, and nothing that happens in the film feels like it has any real impact or consequences until the last few minutes where we see our main character finally crash. And it's not shown through an intricate plot device that suddenly crops up. It's shown by her waking up on a bus to find her boyfriend is missing, proceeding to freak out and panic over not knowing where he is, and then wandering down the street crying after being thrown off the bus as she tries to make sense of what all just happened. The last words that she says in the film are, "I don't even know what's going on." A lot more simple, but a million times more appealing. I'd like for this series to be more focused on these random conversations that are seen throughout, since not only do these conversations have a comedic aspect that I think should be more present in the film, but I also think that it would totally change the feeling of this movie and break the tradition of Ralph making these dark, edgy thrillers and try something a bit more experimental and lighthearted for once. In terms of cinematography, I'd say that this is probably Ralph's best looking project by far, because to my surprise, he actually learned how to color grade. But that doesn't mean that he's off the hook. As a filmmaker, and more importantly as an artist, it's important to understand that there's always room for improvement. The series was shot on the Panasonic GH5, which, while having the benefit of being 4K, has some disadvantages as well. For one, the GH5 has a micro four thirds sensor, which, if you don't know anything about cameras, just means that the sensor is really, really tiny. This makes getting cinematic shots a lot more difficult because a smaller sensor means a wider depth of field, which means that even when you're shooting with the aperture wide open, you're still not getting nearly as much bokeh as you would get on a larger sensor camera. The GH5 also has really bad skin tone highlights, which makes a lot of the footage coming from it look a lot more like news broadcast footage than actual cinema grade footage. Because of this, I actually prefer the look of Lover over Golden Hour because even though it's in black and white, it was shot on an actual cinema camera, and the footage definitely has that cinematic polish to it. However, the black and white aesthetic rarely allowed Ralph to show off any face lighting techniques, and Ralph more than makes up for that here. This series has some really amazing lighting scattered throughout it, and it easily makes this Ralph's most professional looking project. My only complaints, however, is that most of the scenes with fancy lighting setups don't make much sense in the context of the world that the characters live in. Like here, the red lighting looks nice, but does the character just have a red light in his house at all times? We see this couch later on in this series and there's no red lighting, so I don't know where the red light would be coming from within the context of this scene, unless for some reason one of them just decided to set up a random red light while they were smoking. We also don't see nearly enough of this fancy lighting since so much of the film takes place outside in broad daylight where the only light that's used is natural sunlight. And while this doesn't look bad, I would have just loved to see more of the fancy indoor lighting that Ralph used earlier in the film. There's also an overabundance of wide shots, and it can be kind of distracting at times seeing the weird barrel distortion around the edges in scenes where it doesn't really feel like it fits. Like, normally wide-angle shots are used to create intimacy within a scene, but a lot of non-intimate scenes are shot using the wide-angle lens, and it just doesn't fit. There's also an overabundance of cross-dissolves, but you could argue that it helps the film carry that sort of stoned, hazy feeling that reflects the character's attitude. But I just think it should have been used more sparingly. There's also a scene in the film that relies on one of my least favorite filmmaking tropes, and it's when our two characters are getting high in this rich person's house, and right after they snort some crushed up pills, they have this trippy drug sequence complete with weird video effects and crazy hallucinations. Now, I'm not going to completely blame Ralph on this one because he's more or less just doing what every other Hollywood movie does whenever a character takes a hallucinogenic drug, but this is probably my least favorite way to depict a character having a bad trip. Especially if your intention is to make it obvious that what the character is doing is bad and is going to have consequences later on. A better way to do it, in my opinion, is to take lesson from this scene in Requiem for a Dream, where after getting high, we sort of just see the characters sitting there zoned out, usually in total silence to let the moment really sink in. To me, the reason why this is really effective is because it lets us observe the characters' bizarre behavior the way it would be seen if we were just sitting in a room with them, and it's a good way of just telling the audience, hey, this isn't normal, and this isn't good. It also makes the audience think about what exactly might be going through the character's head at this point in time. Now let's get to the biggest elephant in the room. Ralph, we need to talk about your audio. The ADR in this series is easily some of Ralph's worst. Looking back at Lover, there wasn't really that much bad ADR, so I didn't really make it a point to rip on the few times where the ADR sounded bad. But here, there's ADR in pretty much every scene, and not only is it just not mixed well, but none of the actors do a good job at dubbing their lines, including Ralph himself.
What?
I said it was nice to hear. I'm glad you're doing well.
I'm talking to my friends.
Oh, okay. Hey, bud. You lost?
Okay, Phil. P, come on.
Hey Casey, how you doing?
Not too bad. How have you been?
I've been good. How was your first year of college?
Listen, I'm not even exaggerating here when I say that this is pretty much on par with the acting in The Room.
Yeah, can I have a dozen red roses, please?
Oh, hi, Johnny. I didn't know it was you. Here you go.
That's me. How much is it?
It'll be $18.
Here you go. Keep the change. Hi, doggy.
You're my favorite customer.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye-bye.
The acting here is so stiff and so unnatural sounding that I honestly don't see how Ralph thought this was by any means acceptable. This series cost $7,000 to make, and I've recorded better ADR in my living room with no money. Wanna play Pokemon? Wanna play Pokemon? Wanna play Pokemon? And it's not just this scene either. The entire series is like this. And it's only made even more annoying knowing that this isn't anything new for Ralph's projects. I have no idea why Ralph insists on making himself the star in all of his own movies because honest to God, the dude cannot act. His performance in this series is probably my least favorite out of any other character, and the fact that I have to sit and listen to this dude deliver some of the most stilted and monotone dialogue I've ever seen in an indie film literally makes me want to just turn the fucking thing off. The series is available on YouTube for free or on Vimeo for $1. However, since I wanted to make my review as thorough as possible, I spent $20 and got the Blu-ray version of the film. And just like the Lover Blu-ray, it's pretty lackluster. There's been some improvements, like how the Golden Hour Blu-ray came with a nice insert, but unlike the Lover Blu-ray, this one won't play on a PS3 or PS4, so I actually had to go out and buy a Blu-ray player just to watch it. On top of that, there's still not nearly enough bonus features. Not counting the trailer, the only bonus feature on the Blu-ray is a short behind-the-scenes video. And while I like the behind-the-scenes video a lot more than I liked the director's commentary on the Lover Blu-ray, it would have been nice to also have the director's commentary on this Blu-ray as well, especially since the short runtime of the behind-the-scenes video paired with the short runtime of the series itself doesn't leave enough content on this Blu-ray to justify spending $20 on it. Literally only about half of the Blu-ray's available space is being used here, and for $20 I just don't see it as worth it. This is easily Ralph's most digestible project. King Candy had way too many technical issues for me to get into the story, and Lover was just really long and boring in my opinion. Golden Hour is Ralph's shortest project to date, and while that does help it feel a lot more digestible, there's also massive technical improvements that really gives the series a certain level of polish that is unlike anything we've seen him do before. However, there's still huge reoccurring issues that Ralph isn't addressing that continue to stalk all of his projects. Ralph rarely gives a good performance as an actor, his sound mixing is god-awful, and his storytelling is redundant since the plot of this series is in close proximity to King Candy. But most of all, the series just completely missed the opportunity to show the true texture of the world of suburban drug dealers, which is a world that I feel would have been far more interesting to try and realistically depict in this series rather than the really shallow plot that Ralph put together instead. Which is why my final rating for Ralph Sepe's Golden Hour is a 6 out of 10. While I feel like certain elements of Ralph's production have improved since Lover, the ones that haven't are now even more noticeable than they ever have been, and so I can't bring myself to give this a higher score than Lover. Hey Alexa, can you play me some music to help me fall asleep? You know, life is good sometimes.